The bus rattled to a stop at the gates of Norfolk Naval Station, the largest base in the United States Navy. Lieutenant James Carter pressed his forehead to the window, watching the sprawling complex unfold before him. Beyond the tall security fences stretched a world of steel-gray ships, rigid marching formations, and the smell of the sea clinging to the air like salt on skin. It was his first day here, and already his pulse beat faster, knowing this was the proving ground for men who wanted to become legends. He adjusted the brim of his cap and exhaled slowly. "This is it," he muttered, half to himself. The bus hissed as the doors opened, and James stepped onto the pavement, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. Around him, sailors moved in brisk lines, carrying clipboards, toolkits, or rifles, depending on their assignments. The energy was different here, tighter, sharper. Everything screamed discipline. James straightened his shoulders, lifting his duffel bag. He had worked years for this moment. Graduating top of his class at Annapolis hadn't been enough. He had clawed his way through every leadership course, every grueling field exercise, every sleepless night studying strategy and logistics. The brass didn't hand opportunities like this to just anyone. This base was reserved for officers with promise, and James Carter was nothing if not promising. The base stretched like a small city rows of gleaming barracks, training grounds, docks lined with destroyers and carriers, and the ever-present hum of helicopters in the distance. He walked through the gates, presenting his papers to the Marine Guards, and allowed himself a small smile. Every salute he received was another confirmation. He had arrived. "Carter James, Lieutenant," one of the officers at the gate read off, glancing at his clipboard. "Assigned to Division 17. Report to Barracks C by 0700 tomorrow." "Yes, sir." James saluted crisply, his posture perfect. He could already imagine himself moving up the chain of command 1st Division officer, then department head, maybe even command of a ship one day. The war games scheduled for next month were his chance to shine. Everyone was whispering about them. Performance there would decide the future for dozens of young officers. As he made his way toward the barracks, James caught snatches of conversation from passing sailors. New admirals arriving this week. First female commander of this base. "Yeah, they say she's tough. Real sharp." James frowned. He didn't care much who the Admiral was. Admirals were so far above his rank that they might as well have been carved from marble statues. His concern wasn't politics, or history, or gender. It was his career. Still, curiosity tugged at the edges of his mind. Whoever this Admiral was, she would be watching the war games, and that meant his performance would matter even more. The barracks loomed ahead, a gray 3-story block of a building with rows of identical windows. Inside, the air was a mixture of sweat, detergent, and faint traces of coffee. James found his assigned room a small space with 2 bunks, 2 lockers, and not much else. His roommate hadn't arrived yet, so he dropped his duffel on the lower bunk and let himself sit for a moment. The silence felt strange. He wasn't used to silence anymore. Training had been constant noise-shouted orders, gunfire, the roar of engines. Here, the quiet pressed against his ears until it was broken by the footsteps of sailors moving through the hallway outside. He stood, restless, and decided to walk the base. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden sheen across the water. Sailors drilled in neat formations on the parade ground, their boots striking the pavement in perfect rhythm. At the docks, crewmen bustled aboard a destroyer, preparing for inspection. Everything felt alive, buzzing with the hum of readiness. As he walked, James's mind drifted to the past. His father had been a Navy man too, though not an officer, just a mechanic who had spent his life in the belly of ships, keeping engines alive. He remembered the stories, told late at night over the kitchen table, of storm-tossed seas and steel giants that seemed to breathe. His father had never made rank, never chased glory, but he had instilled in James the dream of more. "You'll wear the uniform, son," his father had told him, "but you'll go further than I ever could. You'll give the orders instead of just fixing the machines." That promise had carried James through sleepless nights at Annapolis, through the exhaustion of survival training, through the sting of failures that he turned into fuel. And now, here he was standing on the deck of destiny, ready to claim what was his. He found himself near the officers' mess, where laughter and chatter spilled out from inside. A group of junior officers leaned against the wall outside, smoking and swapping stories. One of them, a tall man with sandy hair, caught James's eye. "Fresh meat?" the man asked, smirking. "Lieutenant James Carter," James introduced himself, standing straighter. "Ah, Division 17. Good luck," the man chuckled, shaking his head. "Your division's a tough one. And with the Admiral coming in, everyone's on edge. Better watch your step." James arched a brow. "You mean Admiral Lawson?" The officer nodded. "That's the one. Rebecca Lawson. Word is, she doesn't tolerate mistakes. She's brilliant, but ruthless. If you screw up, you won't just get chewed out, you'll be gone. Career over." James crossed his arms, hiding his unease. "I don't plan on screwing up." The officer smirked. "None of us do. But it happens anyway." With that cryptic warning, the group drifted off, leaving James with the weight of their words. Ruthless, brilliant, unforgiving, that was the Admiral he'd soon be serving under. He shook his head, forcing the thought away. Admirals didn't notice lieutenants. Not unless those lieutenants gave them a reason to. By the time James returned to his barracks, the stars had begun to pierce the night sky. His roommate had arrived, a quiet ensign, already asleep on the top bunk. James changed into his undershirt, lay back on his bed, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind replayed the day's images, the vast ships in the harbor, the murmurs about Admiral Lawson, the thought of the war games ahead. His heart thudded with excitement and fear, tangled together. Tomorrow would be the first true step of his career. He didn't know that within 48 hours, everything would change. His ambition would collide head-on with a mistake so reckless, so unthinkable, it would nearly cost him everything. And it would happen in the most humiliating way possible. For now, though, James closed his eyes and let the hum of the bass lull him into uneasy sleep. He dreamed of steel giants rising from the water, of a woman's voice cutting through the storm, and of destiny waiting just around the corner. The morning came crisp and sharp, the kind of day that carried a sense of electricity in the air. Lieutenant James Carter awoke before dawn, as always, lacing his boots in the half-light of the barracks. His roommate, still groggy, muttered something unintelligible and rolled over. But James was already up, his energy bristling with the anticipation of a day that might finally put him on the radar of the commanding staff. The corridors hummed with activity as men hurried to assignments, exchanging quick greetings and shouts over the clamor of footsteps. James carried himself with rigid discipline, duffel over one shoulder, face composed. He wanted to set a tone professional, serious, ready for leadership. He didn't just walk these halls. He claimed them. But beneath the surface of that confidence, the tension gnawed. The upcoming war games loomed like a storm on the horizon, and every officer knew their performance would shape careers. A stumble here wasn't just a mistake. It was a scar that could follow a man forever. James had no intention of stumbling. He arrived early for a strategy meeting, only to find the conference room still locked. Irritation flared. He hated waiting. Punctuality was his religion. So he lingered in the hallway, arms crossed, watching as other officers filtered in. Some saluted politely, Others barely nodded. James returned each gesture with a clipped sharpness. His pride made him rigid, and his eyes often lingered a beat too long on those who appeared careless. It was then the trouble began. "Carter," a voice called from behind. He turned to see Lieutenant Marcus Hall, a man he'd butted heads with more than once during training. Hall was taller, broader, and carried himself with the lazy confidence of someone who believed charm could substitute for discipline. His uniform was regulation, but only just. His cap sat at a slight angle. His boots bore faint scuffs. "Hall," James replied flatly. "You're wound up tight, as usual," Hall said with a grin. "Loosen up. The Admiral's not here yet. Nobody's keeping score." James's jaw tightened. Discipline doesn't start when the Admiral walks in. It's constant. That's the difference between men who lead and men who follow. Hall's smirk widened. "You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you? Always quoting manuals, always talking like you're already a captain." James's hands curled into fists. He had heard this too many times, the accusation that he was arrogant, that he carried himself above his peers. It wasn't arrogance, he told himself. It was ambition. It was standards. Why should he apologize for wanting to rise higher than mediocrity? "You don't understand," James snapped. "This isn't a game. Every move we make here decides our future. You walk around like it's a college dorm, but some of us—" "Oh, spare me the speech," Hall cut in, stepping closer. "Not everything is about you climbing the ladder. Maybe try being part of a team for once." The words stung. Too much. Something in James cracked. The endless pressure, the whispered doubts, the constant need to prove himself. It all boiled over in a single reckless instant. He shoved Hall hard against the wall, pinning him with his forearm pressed against his chest. The corridor froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Footsteps halted. Gasps echoed through the silence, like the hiss of air escaping a pressurized tank. James's breath came fast, ragged. His heart thundered in his ears. Hall's smirk vanished, replaced by shock, but James didn't notice. His world had narrowed to a single point, the release of pent-up frustration, coursing through his body as his muscles held another man in place. And then Lieutenant Carter. The voice cut through him like a blade, cold, precise, uncheckable. James turned his head slowly, dread flooding his veins. Standing not 3 feet away was a woman in immaculate dress whites, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable. Silver hair tied back in regulation neatness, eyes sharp as glass, metals gleaming against her chest. For a heartbeat, James didn't recognize her. His mind refused to process what his eyes were telling him. But then the stars on her collar caught the light, and the truth slammed into him with the force of a torpedo. Admiral Rebecca Lawson, the new commanding officer of the base. The woman he had just assaulted. James's arm jerked back as though burned, his body stumbling away from the wall. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The hall was so silent now that the hum of fluorescent lights above seemed deafening. Every pair of eyes was fixed on him, wide with disbelief. Admiral Lawson did not move. She stood tall, her gaze locked on him with the kind of calm that was more terrifying than rage. "Lieutenant," she said, each syllable slow, deliberate, "do you have any idea what you've just done?" The words punched the air from his lungs. He snapped into a salute, hand trembling despite his best effort to control it. His throat felt dry, his tongue useless. He wanted to speak, to explain, to beg forgiveness, but nothing coherent formed. Lawson's eyes flicked to Hall, still pressed against the wall, then back to James. Her stare didn't waver. Around them, the corridor buzzed again, not with sound, but with energy. Officers and sailors leaned forward slightly, as though afraid to breathe, desperate not to miss a second of what was happening. It wasn't every day a lieutenant made a mistake of this magnitude. "Report to my office," Lawson said finally. Her voice was calm, almost quiet. Now, James's stomach dropped. He lowered his salute, nodding stiffly. "Yes, ma'am," he managed, though his voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. She turned on her heel and walked away, her presence parting the corridor like a ship cutting through waves. James followed, his legs heavy, every step echoing his career crumbling beneath him. Behind him, the whispers began. "Did you see?" He shoved her. "He's finished. Absolutely finished." James's ears burned, but he forced himself forward. The walls seemed to close in around him, the once bright corridors now a tunnel leading straight into the abyss. He had been on the base less than 24 hours, and already he had made the kind of mistake men never came back from. When they reached her office, Lawson opened the door and gestured inside. James entered, the space swallowing him whole. It was a room of authority, large desk, neatly arranged files, an American flag in one corner, a framed photo of a naval carrier in another. The air smelled faintly of coffee and leather. "Sit," Lawson commanded. James obeyed, lowering himself into the chair across from her desk. His hands gripped his knees to stop them from shaking. She sat down, folding her hands together, eyes never leaving his. The silence stretched long enough for James to feel like he might suffocate. "Lieutenant Carter," she said at last, her tone controlled but edged with steel, "you have just committed an act that could end your career before it begins. You assaulted a fellow officer, and worse, you laid hands on your commanding admiral." James swallowed hard, his throat aching. "Ma'am, I don't," she cut him off, her hand raising slightly. "Excuses are meaningless. Intent is meaningless. What matters is action. And your action was reckless, undisciplined, and unacceptable." The words carved into him like knives. Each one left a scar he knew would never fade. James stared at the floor, his mind spinning. This was it. His father's dreams, his years of sacrifice, his own burning ambition, all of it about to be snuffed out because of one moment of weakness. He wanted to beg, to promise he could do better, to insist this wasn't who he truly was. But in the end, he remained silent, because deep down, he knew the truth. He had crossed a line no officer ever should. And now, only Admiral Lawson held the power to decide whether James Carter would rise or fall. The silence inside Admiral Lawson's office pressed down on Lieutenant James Carter like the crushing weight of the ocean. Above a submarine, every second felt stretched, drawn thin, as if time itself were punishing him. Admiral Rebecca Lawson didn't look at her papers, didn't glance at the clock, didn't so much as shift in her chair. Her eyes stayed locked on James, sharp and unblinking, as though she were dissecting him without a scalpel. For James, it was unbearable. He had faced screaming drill instructors. He had crawled through mud while artillery thundered overhead. But this silence, this calm judgment, was worse than any storm. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Ma'am, stop." The single word landed like a gavel slamming down. James's mouth snapped shut. Admiral Lawson leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. Her uniform was immaculate, not a crease out of place, the polished shine of her medals reflecting the overhead light. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent decades carving a name into the unforgiving stone of military service. And in that moment, James understood this was not just another senior officer. This was a woman who commanded empires of steel and men. "Do you have any idea what you just did, Lieutenant?" Her tone was measured, deliberate. James straightened his posture, though his insides twisted. "Yes, ma'am. No, you don't." Her eyes narrowed. "If you did, you wouldn't have laid a hand on anyone, let alone your commanding officer." The words pierced deep, each one laced with the weight of her rank. James wanted to defend himself, to explain that it had been a mistake born of frustration, that Hall had provoked him, that it hadn't been what it looked like. But the truth was undeniable. He had lost control. And in the Navy, control wasn't optional. It was everything. Lawson rose from her chair, moving to stand behind her desk. She wasn't tall, not compared to James, but her presence filled the room. Her shadow seemed to stretch across him, like the bow of a battleship looming over a sailor in a lifeboat. "When you shoved that officer against the wall," she said, her voice cold but steady, "you didn't just commit an act of violence. You showed me your weakness." James's head shot up, stung. Weakness. The word felt like a slap. "Ma'am, I told you to stop." Her interruption was so sharp that James flinched. He clamped his jaw shut, his pride screaming inside him. Lawson studied him a moment longer before pacing slowly along the edge of the desk. Her boots clicked against the floor in precise rhythm. "Do you know why lieutenants like you fail, Carter?" He dared to answer. "Ma'am? Because you mistake ambition for leadership. You think pushing harder, climbing faster, being louder than the rest will get you where you want to go." She paused, her eyes piercing his. "But leadership isn't about power. It's about control. About knowing when to stand firm and when to hold back. And you, Lieutenant, just demonstrated you don't understand that at all." The words hit harder than any reprimand he'd ever endured. James felt his cheeks burn, shame and fury warring inside him. He did understand leadership, didn't he? He had studied it, trained for it, lived for it. But looking into her eyes, he realized she saw through him in a way no one else had. "You want to rise, don't you?" Lawson asked suddenly. "Yes, ma'am," James replied without hesitation. His voice cracked, betraying the desperation under the words. Her gaze didn't soften. "Then you'd better learn something right now. Stars aren't pinned on men who can't control their temper. The Navy doesn't promote brawlers. It promotes leaders." James's hands tightened on his knees. Every part of him wanted to argue, to insist this wasn't who he really was, that he had made one mistake and it shouldn't define him. But deep down, he knew the truth. This mistake would define him, unless she chose otherwise. Lawson leaned forward, planting both hands on the desk. Her voice dropped lower, quieter, but it carried a force that pinned him harder than when he had shoved Hall. "You shoved me, Lieutenant, me, your commanding Admiral. Do you grasp how close you are to the end of your career?" James forced himself to meet her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply studying him with that unreadable stare. Then she moved back around the desk, lowering herself into her chair again. "The regulations give me the power to end your commission today," she said flatly. "One report from me, and you're finished. Do you understand that?" James's stomach twisted. His father's face flashed through his mind. The pride in his eyes when James graduated Annapolis. The way he had said, "You'll go further than I ever did, son." All of that could be gone, erased, in a single stroke of her pen. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. She tilted her head slightly, watching him. "And yet," she continued, "I don't believe in throwing away potential lightly. You're reckless, but you're not without promise. So here's what's going to happen." James's heart hammered. This was it, the verdict. "You will not be dismissed," Lawson said. "Not yet. Instead, you will train under my direct oversight. Every mistake you make, I will see. Every failure, every weakness, every flaw you will answer to me. You will learn what it means to lead, or you will break under the weight of the lesson. Do you understand? Shock rippled through him. Relief, dread, disbelief, they tangled together until he could barely think. She wasn't ending his career, but what she was offering might be worse. Yes, ma'am, he said again, his voice steadier this time. Lawson leaned back, folding her arms. Good. Then let this be the last time you ever lay a hand on another officer in anger. Because next time, Lieutenant, I will not give you a second chance. The words settled over him like chains heavy, unshakable, binding him to a future he hadn't expected. Dismissed, Lawson said at last. James rose, saluting sharply before turning toward the door. His steps felt uneven, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath him. He reached the corridor, the whispers of curious officers still lingering in the air, and for the first time since arriving at the base, James Carter felt small. The stars on Lawson's collar flashed in his mind's eye, searing themselves into memory. He had thought ambition was enough. He had thought skill and hunger would carry him forward. But now he understood. His fate lay in the hands of a woman whose gaze could cut through steel, and whose rank towered above him like a mountain. He had pinned her against a wall, and she had just pinned his future in hers. The summons came before dawn. James Carter hadn't slept much the night before. How could he? His mind had replayed the moment again and again. The shove, the gasps, the sudden, horrifying realization that the officer he had pinned was Admiral Rebecca Lawson. The more he tried to shake it, the tighter it clung to him, a loop of shame and dread that gnawed through the night. When the knock on his door came, sharp and deliberate, his stomach sank. He opened it to find a Marine in dress uniform standing at attention. Lieutenant Carter, the Marine arced. Report to the disciplinary board at 0700. Full dress whites. No delay. James's throat tightened. Yes, Sergeant, he replied, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. The Marine saluted crisply, then turned on his heel and left. James stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty hallway, his heart hammering. He knew what this meant. The board was no formality. It was judgment. By the time he arrived at the boardroom, James felt the weight of 100 eyes. Word of what had happened spread across the base like wildfire. Officers didn't shove admirals. Lieutenants didn't survive mistakes like his. Whispers followed him through the corridors, sailors turning their heads as he passed. The boardroom was a cavern of polished wood and brass, flags lining the walls, portraits of stern-faced admirals watching from frames. At the center sat a long table, behind which 3 senior officers waited. At the center of them, like the eye of a storm, sat Admiral Rebecca Lawson. James's pulse spiked. Her uniform was pristine, her posture impeccable. She gave no sign of emotion, not anger, not pity, not even recognition. She might as well have been carved from steel. A clerk called the room to order. James stood at attention in the center of the floor, every muscle locked, trying to project the same discipline he had so carelessly abandoned yesterday. Lieutenant James Carter, one of the captains began, his voice echoing through the chamber. You stand accused of conduct unbecoming an officer, specifically the physical assault of your commanding admiral. Do you admit to these charges? The room seemed to tilt. James's hands itched to ball into fists, but he forced them still at his sides. His voice came low, but steady. Yes, sir. I admit to the charges. A murmur rippled among the junior officers seated along the walls as observers. Admitting guilt without excuse was rare, but James knew excuses would mean nothing. The captain nodded, his expression unreadable. Very well. Do you wish to make a statement in your defense before the board renders judgment? James inhaled, the air sharp in his lungs. He thought of his father, of Annapolis, of the years of sweat and sacrifice. He thought of Lawson's eyes yesterday, sharp as a blade. "Sir," he said, "I make no defense. My actions were reckless, unprofessional, and dishonorable. I can only say they will never be repeated." His words hung in the air like smoke, fragile and thin. He wondered if they sounded sincere or desperate. The captain nodded again, then looked toward Lawson. "Admiral, as commanding officer, you are entitled to make recommendation on punishment." The room held its breath. Every gaze shifted to Lawson, waiting. She rose slowly, her presence filling the space like the swell of a tide. She stepped forward, her boots striking the polished floor in measured rhythm. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of iron. "By rights," she began, "this lieutenant should be dismissed from service, effective immediately. He has demonstrated a failure of discipline and a disregard for the chain of command. Were I to recommend dismissal, it would be well within my authority and well within reason." James's chest constricted. This was it. The end. But the single word cracked like a gunshot. Heads tilted. Murmurs rippled again, quickly silenced. Lawson's eyes swept the room before settling on James. "I do not believe in wasting potential lightly. Lieutenant Carter is reckless, yes. Undisciplined, certainly. But he is not without skill. And skill, when properly forged, can serve the Navy." James's pulse hammered. "Was she? I therefore recommend," Lawson continued, "that dismissal be withheld. Instead, Lieutenant Carter will serve under my direct supervision. He will undergo additional training, report to me daily, and be subject to review at my discretion. His career will either be rebuilt through discipline, or it will break under the weight of his failures. The choice will be his." The room erupted in whispers. Officers exchanged glances of disbelief. Never had anyone heard of such a punishment, more grueling than dismissal, more personal than demotion. James stood frozen. Relief flooded him, but so did dread. She wasn't sparing him. She was binding him to her. His future lay not in his own hands anymore, but in the hands of the Admiral he had humiliated. The captain at the table cleared his throat. "Admiral Lawson's recommendation is accepted. Lieutenant Carter, you will follow her orders without fail. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," James said quickly, his voice steady, though his heart roared. Dismissed. Outside the boardroom, the air felt heavier. A group of officers lingered nearby, their eyes following him as he walked past. He caught the low hiss of their whispers. "Lucky bastard." Or "unlucky." "Lawson will tear him apart. He'll wish he'd been dismissed." James ignored them, his eyes fixed forward, his jaw tight. Lucky, unlucky, neither mattered. All that mattered was survival. He reached the courtyard, sunlight glaring off the polished stones. He stood still, inhaling deeply. Relief battled with humiliation in his chest. He hadn't been dismissed, but in some ways, it might have been easier if he had. Because now, every step he took, every breath he drew, every mistake he made, would happen under Admiral Lawson's gaze. And she was not a woman known for mercy. That evening, James returned to his barracks, exhaustion pulling at his body. He dropped onto his bunk, staring at the ceiling. His roommate glanced down from the top bunk. "Word is you're working directly under the Admiral," the ensign whispered, wide-eyed. James closed his eyes. "Yeah, that's brutal. Brutal." The word echoed in his mind. He thought of Lawson's voice in the boardroom, steady and unyielding. "You will either rebuild through discipline or break." James exhaled slowly. He didn't know yet whether he would rebuild or break. But he did know one thing. The consequences of yesterday's mistake weren't over. They had only just begun. James Carter had thought he understood discipline. 4 years at Annapolis, countless inspections, endless drills. The Navy had shaped him, hardened him, molded him into what he believed was a model officer. But nothing had prepared him for Admiral Lawson's brand of discipline. From the first day under her supervision, she dismantled the comfortable framework he had built around himself. There was no gradual easing, no chance to adapt. It was a storm that began at dawn and did not end until exhaustion dragged him into restless sleep. At 0500, the first whistle shrieked. James stumbled from his bunk, already half-dressed, boots unlaced. He wasn't the only one. A dozen lieutenants and ensigns stood blinking in the cold courtyard, their breath fogging in the pre-dawn air. At the center stood Lawson, immaculate in her uniform, her cap gleaming under the floodlights. "Line up," she barked. They scrambled into formation. James forced his body rigid, though his eyes burned with fatigue. Lawson's gaze swept the line like a searchlight, sharp and unforgiving. "You are officers of the United States Navy," she said, her voice carrying through the courtyard. "You think that means you've earned respect. You think rank shields you. You're wrong. Rank is responsibility, not reward. And today, you will learn what responsibility feels like." Her eyes locked on James for the briefest moment, long enough to ignite a fire of humiliation in his chest. She was speaking to all of them, but he knew her words were meant for him. "Drop and give me 50. The line groaned, but none dared hesitate. They hit the ground in unison. James's arms strained as he pushed through the first set, his breath puffing against the concrete. Lawson paced between them like a wolf among prey. 50 more. Muscles screamed. Sweat dampened uniforms. Someone grunted in pain, and Lawson's boots halted beside him. "Pain is the language of limits," she snapped. "And limits are lies. Push past them." James gritted his teeth. Every push-up felt like a punishment, not for the group, but for him alone. Every command, every drill, was a blade aimed at his pride. When the exercises finally ended, dawn was breaking. The others staggered back to barracks for a brief reprieve, but Lawson called James forward. "Lieutenant Carter," she said, her voice steady. "You will run 5 miles, alone. Report back in 40 minutes. James swallowed hard. "Yes, Admiral." His legs felt like lead, but he ran. Past the docks where ships rocked in the tide. Past the warehouses and watchtowers. Past curious sailors who watched him with raised brows, whispering behind their hands. His lungs burned, his calves threatened to give out, but he forced himself onward. When he returned, soaked in sweat, Lawson was waiting. Her face betrayed nothing. 43 minutes, she said. Too slow. Tomorrow, 38. Then she dismissed him without another word. The days blurred into each other. Inspections, drills, lectures. Lawson pushed him harder than the rest, singling him out in subtle, merciless ways. During navigation exercises, she questioned him first, drilling into every mistake. "Carter," she would say, her tone razor-sharp, "if you miscalculate this course by a single degree, your ship drifts miles off target. Do you know what happens then? Sailors die. Do it again." During weapons training, she made him run extra laps when his aim wavered. During tactical discussions, she forced him to argue strategies until his throat was raw. He hated it. He hated her. And yet, there was something in her relentlessness, something beyond cruelty. She was shaping him. Each demand chipped away at his arrogance. Each correction forged something harder, sharper in its place. One night, weeks into the ordeal, James sat slumped on his bunk, muscles trembling from the day's drills. His roommate, Ensign Morales, glanced down from the top bunk. "She's killing you," Morales said quietly. James didn't answer. Morales leaned forward. No, seriously. Every officer here knows she's got it out for you. Why doesn't she just end it? Why not dismiss you like anyone else? James stared at the floor, sweat dripping from his hair. He didn't know the answer. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Lawson's face again. Not cruel, not even angry. Just determined. Like a blacksmith staring at a blade that wasn't sharp enough yet. She doesn't want me gone, James muttered finally. She wants me better. The breaking point came during a storm. The base was conducting a simulated emergency drill, with lightning splitting the night sky and rain hammering the decks. Officers scrambled to secure equipment, shouting orders drowned by the roar of wind. James was assigned to coordinate a group of ensigns moving supplies to safety. But one ensign slipped, nearly swept overboard by the surging tide. James lunged, grabbing his arm and dragging him back to safety. The chaos was overwhelming, his orders barely audible. For a moment, James faltered, fear gnawing at his gut. Then he heard her voice, Lawson's, cutting through the storm like a blade. Lead them, Carter. If you break now, they break with you. Something snapped into place. The fear burned away. His voice rose, louder than the thunder. Secure that line. Move those crates. Stay low and keep moving. The ensigns rallied, responding to his commands. Together, they wrestled the supplies into safety, drenched and shivering but alive. When the storm passed, James stood on the slick deck, chest heaving. The ensigns clapped him on the back, their faces pale but grateful. He turned, and there she was. Admiral Lawson stood a few paces away, rain streaming down her cap, her eyes locked on him. For the first time since this ordeal began, her lips curved in the faintest hint of approval. It wasn't praise, not yet, but it was something. That night, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His body ached, his eyes stung, but his chest felt strangely light. He realized something that chilled him and comforted him all at once. He no longer feared Lawson's judgment. He craved it, because every time she tore him down, every time she pushed him harder, he was building into something stronger than he had ever been before. And deep down, beneath the humiliation and exhaustion, he knew one truth. Admiral Rebecca Lawson wasn't his enemy. She was becoming his greatest test, and perhaps his greatest teacher. The storm had been a lesson, but Admiral Lawson had warned them. Lessons prepare you, they do not define you. James Carter didn't realize how soon that warning would come true. It started during the war games. The entire base was a hive of activity. Ships moving in and out of the harbor, helicopters buzzing overhead, cadets and officers scrambling to their stations. It was the Navy's proving ground, a massive simulation designed to test readiness under fire. For weeks, everyone had trained for it. But as the sirens blared and the orders rolled out, James sensed something different. This wasn't just a game. Lawson's eyes were sharper than usual that morning. She gathered the officers under her command and said, "War games are designed to break you. They strip away comfort and reveal whether you are leaders or liabilities. Fail here, and your failure will echo in the real world. Do not forget that." Her gaze landed on James, longer, harder. He understood. This was his moment. James was assigned as tactical lead for a small detachment of junior officers. Their task simple on paper: secure a convoy of supply vessels moving through a mock hostile zone. But nothing in war games stayed simple for long. By midday, the convoy was underway, the gray silhouettes of supply ships rolling across the choppy sea. James stood on the deck of the lead escort vessel, scanning the horizon. His detachment waited on his orders, every one of them nervous but steady. Suddenly, alarms wailed. Simulated missile fire appeared on radar. Within seconds, the enemy had jammed communications. The exercise had escalated. Their convoy was under attack, cut off and exposed. James's throat tightened. He had trained for this, drilled tactics under Lawson's relentless eye. But theory was a weak shield against the sudden weight of responsibility. Every decision he made in the next minutes would ripple across lives. Even in simulation, the Navy treated it like life or death. "Carter!" Ensign Morales shouted from the console. "We've lost contact with command." James swallowed hard. His mind raced through possibilities. Retreat would mean failure. Staying exposed meant destruction. He forced himself to breathe, to remember Lawson's voice. "If you break, they break with you." "Form a defensive wedge," James barked. Vessels tighten formation. "Helm, bring us 40 degrees starboard. We'll use the cargo ships as partial cover until we clear radar interference." Orders flew. His detachment scrambled. The ships shifted, engines roaring as they maneuvered. James's pulse thundered in his ears, but his voice stayed steady. For the first time, the junior officers obeyed him without question. The radar flared again. Simulated enemy patrol craft were closing in fast. "Arm countermeasures," James ordered. "Target lead patrol, fire on my mark." The deck vibrated as simulated missiles launched. The radar blip representing the lead enemy craft winked out. A cheer rippled across the bridge. But then, chaos. A supply ship in the middle of the convoy listed sharply. Smoke, real not simulated, began to rise from its deck. A live fire had broken out, triggered by electrical failure in the storm-drenched equipment. This wasn't part of the exercise. This was real. "Sir," Morales shouted. "Ship 3 is on fire. Crew trapped below deck." For a split second, James froze. He was supposed to protect the convoy, not rescue crews. The rules of the war games didn't cover this. But another voice cut through the storm inside his head, Lawson's from days before. "Responsibility means every soul under your command. Every single one. Do not forget that." James grabbed the comm. "Break simulation. Alert medics and fire teams. Helm, bring us alongside Ship 3. I'm taking a team aboard." The officer at his side hesitated. "But sir, what about the convoy?" "If we break formation, they'll hold," James snapped. "Those sailors won't." He didn't wait for argument. He grabbed a life vest, a mask, and sprinted to the deck. A handful of officers followed, fear etched into their faces. They lowered a launch boat into the water, waves crashing against its sides, and sped toward the stricken supply ship. The smoke thickened as they drew close, acrid and choking. Flames licked along the deck, sailors waving frantically for help. James's boots hit the slick steel with a thud as he climbed aboard. "Move! Get hoses on that fire." "Morales with me." Crews trapped below. They forced their way down into the ship, smoke stinging their eyes, heat pressing against their skin. James coughed, his lungs burning, but he kept moving. The passageways twisted, each step slower, heavier. Finally, they found them. 3 sailors pinned by debris, coughing violently. "Help us," one rasped. James and Morales heaved at the wreckage, muscles screaming. Inch by inch, the debris shifted until the sailors crawled free. James shoved them toward the stairwell. The flames roared louder, the deck above groaning as if ready to collapse. "Go," James barked. "I'll cover you." He grabbed a fire extinguisher, blasting the flames back just long enough for Morales and the sailors to escape. Smoke swallowed him, heat blistering his skin. For a moment, he thought he wouldn't make it out. But then strong arms seized his shoulder, dragging him upward. Morales, coughing and pale, pulled him toward the deck. Together, they stumbled into the night air, collapsing against the railing as hoses doused the flames. When they returned to the escort vessel, soaked, blackened with soot, James expected anger. He had broken formation, abandoned simulation protocol. Instead, Admiral Lawson was waiting on the pier. Her eyes locked onto him as he disembarked. For a long moment, neither spoke. James stood rigid, trembling with adrenaline, smoke still clinging to his uniform. Finally, Lawson broke the silence. Her voice was low, controlled. "You abandoned the exercise. You disobeyed protocol." James swallowed hard. "Yes, Admiral. I did. You risked the convoy for 3 sailors." "Yes, Admiral." She stepped closer, her eyes like steel. "And you saved them." James blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Lawson's gaze didn't soften, but her words carried a weight he hadn't heard before. Leadership isn't about following a script. It's about knowing when the script is wrong. Today, you chose people over rules. That choice is why those sailors are alive. A pause. The faintest nod. "Well done, Lieutenant." The words struck harder than any punishment. James stood frozen, his chest tight, his throat aching. For the first time since his mistake in that hallway weeks ago, he felt something shift. Lawson wasn't just testing him anymore. She was beginning to trust him. That night, James sat alone in his quarters, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his veins. His hands still trembled, the memory of fire and smoke vivid in his mind. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a steady, quiet pride. Not in himself alone, but in the knowledge that when the moment had come, he hadn't broken. And when he closed his eyes, he remembered Lawson's final words on the pier. "Well done, Lieutenant." The weight of those 3 words was heavier than any punishment he had ever borne. And for the first time, James Carter believed he might just become the officer she demanded he be. The morning after the fire, the base buzzed like a hornet's nest. Word of what had happened spread faster than any official report could contain it. Officers and sailors alike whispered James Carter's name, some with admiration, some with disbelief, and others with a wary mix of both. It was one thing to run drills. It was another to defy simulation protocol and throw yourself into real danger for the lives of a few trapped sailors. For days, the conversation refused to die down. Wherever James went, heads turned. Some clapped him on the back with muttered, "Good jobs," while others glared, convinced he'd broken the rules and should have been disciplined harshly. But the most important voice was the one that had stayed silent since the night of the fire, Admiral Rebecca Lawson's. James found himself summoned to her office 3 days later. He entered with a pounding heart, his uniform pressed, his posture flawless. Her office was austere, lined with maps, naval awards, and a single framed photograph of a destroyer at sea. Lawson stood behind her desk, hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the window overlooking the harbor. "Lieutenant Carter," she said without turning. "Admiral," James replied, standing at rigid attention. For a long moment, silence hung between them. James's nerves twisted tighter with every heartbeat. Then Lawson turned, her expression as unreadable as ever. "You broke formation. You abandoned simulation protocols. You exposed your unit to unnecessary risk." "Yes, Admiral," James said, his throat dry. "And in doing so, you saved 3 sailors from burning alive." Her eyes locked onto his, sharp and piercing. "Explain yourself." James inhaled slowly. He had rehearsed this moment, but now that it had come, the words felt heavier than he expected. "Admiral, the convoy could continue without me. Those sailors couldn't. My responsibility was to every life under my watch. If that meant breaking the simulation, then it was the only choice I could make." Lawson studied him for a long, unsettling silence. Then finally, she nodded once. Correct. James blinked. Admiral? You made the right call, she said evenly. That is what leadership looks like. Knowing when to obey and when obedience becomes negligence. Most officers never learn that distinction. You did, under fire. James's chest tightened, a strange warmth stirring beneath his ribs. For weeks he had endured her merciless training, her scathing corrections, her endless demands. But now, hearing her acknowledgement, not praise, not indulgence, but recognition, it meant more than he had imagined. Thank you, Admiral, he said quietly. She stepped closer, her presence commanding, her eyes unwavering. Do not mistake me, Lieutenant. This does not absolve you of your earlier failure. You still have much to prove, but a faint shift touched her expression, a ghost of a smile that didn't quite reach her lips. You are no longer the same officer who shoved his commanding admiral against a wall. That man is gone. You are beginning to understand what it means to lead. James felt the words like a weight lifted off his shoulders. For the first time, he wasn't just enduring her gaze. He was meeting it head on. From that day forward, something changed. Training didn't become easier. Lawson never allowed ease. But the tone shifted. Where once she had seemed intent on breaking him, now she seemed intent on building him. Her corrections carried less venom and more precision. Her challenges weren't traps designed to humiliate him, but trials meant to sharpen him. Others noticed the change too. During tactical meetings, when James spoke, people listened. Not just because Lawson demanded it, but because he had proven himself in fire and smoke. His voice carried weight now. When junior officers hesitated, James's steady tone calmed them. When debates grew heated, his arguments cut through noise like a blade. One evening after a particularly brutal strategy session, Morales pulled him aside. You realize what's happening, don't you? Morales asked, grinning. James frowned. What do you mean? You're not just surviving her. You're becoming her. Look at the way you talk, the way you command. You sound like Lawson now. James chuckled, though unease flickered inside him. Was that true? Was he becoming her reflection? Or was she simply carving away the weaknesses that had always been there, revealing something that had waited beneath? The next true test came not in drills or in crisis, but in trust. Lawson summoned James to her office again, late one night. The base was quiet, the corridors empty. She stood over her desk, poring over classified maps and intelligence reports. Without looking up, she gestured to the chair opposite. Sit. James obeyed, his curiosity burning. These are fleet movement projections, she said, sliding a folder toward him. Most officers under my command will never see them. But I want your assessment. James blinked, stunned. Admiral, Assess, Lieutenant, she said sharply. That's an order. He swallowed hard, then opened the folder. Maps of the Pacific spread before him, dotted with notations and coded signals. He studied them, his mind racing. He traced possible routes, considered enemy counters, weighed risks. Finally, he looked up. Admiral, if the fleet moves as projected, they'll expose a flank near Okinawa. It's subtle, but exploitable. I'd suggest a diversionary maneuver through the Philippines to mask the vulnerability. Lawson's eyes narrowed, studying him as much as the map. And what makes you so certain? James held her gaze. Because if I were the enemy, that's where I'd strike. And I'd win. The silence stretched, the weight of her scrutiny pressing down. Then, at last, she closed the folder. Good, she said simply. Very good. James exhaled slowly, relief mingling with pride. She had trusted him with something few ever saw. And he had not failed. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened into something more complex than commander and subordinate. Respect flowed between them, not freely, but earned in sweat and fire. Lawson never softened. She was still the Admiral, still sharp as steel, still merciless in her expectations. But sometimes, in the quiet after drills or in the tense stillness of strategy briefings, James caught glimpses of the person behind the rank. A dry wit in the corner of her mouth. A flicker of weariness in her eyes when she thought no one watched. A moment of silence at the photograph of the destroyer on her wall, a ship she had commanded years before, lost in combat. James began to realize that her steel came not from cruelty, but from loss. From carrying the weight of command long enough to know what failure cost. And in turn, Lawson began to see something in him she hadn't expected. Not just a reckless lieutenant to be broken, but a leader in the making. It all came to a head during one of their late-night sessions. James lingered after presenting his tactical assessment, his hand resting nervously on the folder. "Admiral," he said softly. "Why me? Why did you keep me on when you could have dismissed me?" Lawson studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Because, Lieutenant," she said finally, "the Navy doesn't need perfect officers. It needs officers who can fail and rise again stronger. You failed spectacularly, but you rose. That is why you're still here." Her words struck deeper than any reprimand ever had. For the first time, James understood. He wasn't her punishment. He was her project. Her gamble. And slowly, impossibly, he was becoming her success. That night, as James walked back to his barracks under the quiet stars, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Pride, not in himself alone, but in the bond he was forging with Admiral Lawson, a bond of steel and fire, of respect earned through trial. He knew the road ahead was still steep, still fraught with tests. But for the first time, he believed he could climb it. And somewhere deep inside, he sensed that Lawson believed it too. The war games ended weeks later, but for James Carter, the real trial was only just beginning. The call came in the middle of the night. A naval destroyer on patrol in the Pacific had suffered catastrophic engine failure during a storm. With communications compromised in waters hostile, the nearest base was still days away. Lawson's detachment was ordered to respond, and James, to his disbelief, was placed second in command of the rescue operation. He stood in Lawson's office as she delivered the assignment. "You've proven you can think under fire," she said, her tone firm, her gaze steady. "Now you'll prove you can lead under it. This isn't a drill, Lieutenant. Real sailors' lives hang in the balance. Fail, and men die." James swallowed hard. "Understood, Admiral." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you?" For a moment, silence. Then James lifted his chin. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." A faint nod. No smile, no warmth. But he didn't need either. That nod was everything. The mission unfolded under a bruised sky, waves slamming against the hull as their task force cut through the Pacific. James stood on the bridge, radio clutched tight, his mind rehearsing every lesson drilled into him. Hours later, the crippled destroyer appeared on the horizon, listing dangerously, smoke rising from its stern. Sailors lined the railings, waving frantically. James's chest tightened. This wasn't simulation. This was real. "Carter," Lawson said, standing beside him. "You're in command of the recovery team. Get them off that ship." For the first time, she was handing him the reins entirely. James exhaled slowly, then squared his shoulders. "Aye, Admiral." The operation was chaos. The storm hadn't relented, waves battering the destroyer as boarding teams fought to secure lines. James led from the front, shouting orders over the roar of the sea, hauling terrified sailors from the crippled vessel onto waiting launches. "Keep the lines taut. Move, move." he barked, his voice cutting through the storm. A young sailor stumbled, nearly swept overboard. James lunged, grabbing his harness and yanking him back. The boy's wide eyes met his, full of fear. "You're all right," James said firmly. "Stay with me. One step at a time." The sailor nodded, steadied, and kept moving. Everywhere, chaos pressed in, but James felt strangely calm. Every command that left his lips carried Lawson's echo. Responsibility for every soul under your command. Every single one. Hours bled into exhaustion, but one by one, the sailors were evacuated. The crippled destroyer groaned, threatening to roll, but James refused to leave until every last man was accounted for. When he finally stepped onto the launch, drenched and trembling, he turned to see the destroyer vanish beneath the waves. It was gone, but its crew lived. Back aboard the base, the rescued sailors gathered, exhausted but alive. James moved among them, checking injuries, offering steady words. They clapped him on the back. Some even saluted him with tearful gratitude. But James knew where the credit belonged. He found Lawson standing apart, her cap pulled low, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Admiral," he said quietly, approaching. She turned, her gaze resting on him. "You brought them home," she said simply. James shook his head. "You brought me here. If you hadn't, enough." Her tone was sharp, but not cold. "You made the choices. You bore the weight. That is leadership, Lieutenant. And it is yours now, not mine." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant cries of gulls. Then Lawson's voice softened, just slightly. "You're ready." James blinked. "Ready?" Her eyes narrowed, but not with scorn, with pride. "Ready to carry the responsibility. Ready to be more than an officer. Ready to lead without me watching over your shoulder." The word struck him harder than any reprimand, harder than any drill. "Thank you, Admiral," James said, his voice low, steady. She gave a faint nod, then turned away. But for the first time, James didn't feel dismissed. He felt trusted. Weeks later, James stood in full dress whites at a promotion ceremony. His name was called, and he stepped forward to receive the insignia of Lieutenant Commander. The hall echoed with applause, but James's eyes searched the crowd until they found Lawson. She stood at the back, silent, her expression unreadable. But when his eyes met hers, she gave the smallest of nods, the same nod she had given on the pier after the fire. It was enough. Years passed. James Carter rose through the ranks, commanding ships of his own, leading sailors through storms and battles. He carried many lessons with him, but none more deeply than the one Lawson had branded into his soul. Leadership is not about authority. It is about responsibility. Not power, but service. And though he faced new storms, new crises, new mistakes, he never again forgot that truth. On the day Admiral Rebecca Lawson retired, James visited her quietly. She was older now, the steel in her hair streaked with silver, but her presence was as formidable as ever. "You've done well," she said simply, after a long silence. James smiled faintly. "I had a good teacher." For once, her lips curved into a true smile. "No, you had a brutal one. But sometimes brutality's what forges steel." James laughed softly, then saluted her, sharp and steady. "Thank you, Admiral, for everything." She returned the salute, her eyes glinting with something rare, something almost tender. "Dismissed, Commander." It was the last time he would hear those words from her lips. But they stayed with him forever. Years later, standing before a new generation of officers, James told them the story, not of his promotions, not of his victories, but of the day he pinned his commanding admiral against a wall. He told it not as a tale of shame, but as the moment that began his transformation. Leadership, he said, his voice steady, isn't born from perfection. It's born from failure, and from the people who refuse to let you stay broken. I was lucky. I had an admiral who saw more in me than I saw in myself. And I will never forget her. The young officers listened, rapt. And as James stepped away, he carried Lawson's voice in his heart still steel, fire and respect forged into the man he had become.